I am a nomad and a wanderer, and I don't like to be cornered over in the room like this, under the roof here. But I'm going to do my best to keep it interesting for you guys. Hey, real quick, I just wanted to thank Project 202 and the XD Leadership Board for this opportunity. I've been with these guys for about a year now. Really have enjoyed the content, really have enjoyed the engagement, and really have enjoyed meeting a lot of really interesting folks, both on the board and then also just other folks that come out to these events. So thank you for your support, and thank you for the opportunity and the platform to share how design can change the world. So let's get into that. So real quick, just a note of context for you guys. My journey to where I am now was sort of had 4 chapters to it. I started as an art director in advertising, very much in the billboard and TV spot and print ad kind of land. As my career grew, so did the landscape for advertising design. I found myself more and more designing experiences, more and more designing for interaction instead of just for conversion. And so I sort of shifted into this digital creative director capacity. Then from there, I actually made what I felt like was a really bold move to quit advertising and to go into the digital, the mobile strategy space. Spent 3 years at a third-party app developer here in Dallas called Bottle Rocket as a digital experience strategist. And that was an incredible shift for me. And as a result, I got to work with some really amazing companies, one of which was Intuit, who came back to me and said, hey, we're starting a design discipline, and we need a leader for that. And would you be willing to come do that? So that's how I got to Intuit. I've been there 4 years, started as a director. They made me a VP last year, which is a tremendous privilege, and now I get a chance to sing the song of design thinking around the world. The long arc of my career has gone from making solutions in search of problems to really starting to understand customer needs and serving them as best we can. This is what I realized was the reason that I didn't like advertising, was that I spent a lot of time convincing people to buy things they probably didn't need. I think that one creative brief said, this is a guy who drinks 18 beers a week and we would like him to drink another 6. That is not solving the world's problems, y'all. So there are 3 kinds of design that I want to call out, especially if you're a non-designer. One is probably the most obvious and the most forward. This is the one of how things look and how they work and how they feel. This is the design that you hire art directors and visual illustrators and all those kind of people to do for you. There's a second kind of design innovation, where you really study customers, where you spend time learning what the needs are, you spend time taking those needs and maybe explaining them in a visual way, maybe using some sort of framework or some sort of metaphor to help paint the picture of where the opportunity is. Journey mapping and all that kinds of stuff, where design is not necessarily what the customer sees, but it's what we see of the customer. And then finally, this idea of rapid prototyping, where you start to prove out these lean assumptions around, well, what's the most important thing to go find out before we head somewhere else? And then once you know that, how do you either pivot or how do you build on your ideas? And then finally, there's the design that is about sort of driving business strategy. This is about taking the assets that you have and the needs of your customers and your particular area of influence where you can own, and using that to create durable advantage. Like we were just talking about the idea of, we've got all this stuff, but what else could we do with it? So design has an opportunity to help you to uncover places where technology or assets that you already have might be able to solve new problems for customers. So this is my quote. I shared this quote with a design teacher out in California, and he said, that is not the definition of design. The This is my definition of design. When we talk about design saving the world, we're talking about the world is a system, right? The world is a system of systems. In fact, the world is probably a system of systems of systems. And so when you think about making change at that level, you really have to think about what are the ways to make big impact. And these are three places that big ideas can fall short. And one of them is that we mistake our business objectives for our customers' needs. And that sounds a little like our customer's problem is they don't know about our product. No, that's your problem. Your customer's problem is that they don't have enough money, or they don't have enough time, or they don't have confidence in their ability to get something done. And your opportunity is to solve that need in a way that nobody else can. The other one is diagnosing a symptom but missing the underlying disease or illness. Like, oh, we can solve this one problem really well, but understanding that within a bigger landscape, solving that problem is not enough. And so design has this great ability to be able to zoom out and zoom in. And you zoom out to look at the whole landscape, and you zoom in to look at what's the one thing we can do right now. But then you got to zoom back out and say, and what would be next? And then the last one is constraining your efforts to what's possible right now. I mean, so many times businesses are driven by what can we do in the next quarter? What can we do with the people we have, with the resources we have, with the assets we have, whatever that thing is. And in the environment that we have, within the system that exists, so many of these things are sort of like you're aiming a little low, and because you're aiming low and there's all that friction, you're almost no doubt gonna fall short. I want to talk a little bit about Intuit. This is our mission. It's to power prosperity around the world. So like I said, this is a big, bold mission. This is going to require a lot of cooperation across a lot of different systems. We have many systems that we have to cooperate with: the banking system, the tax system, not only of the IRS, hell yeah, tax day yesterday, but also every individual state. And then that starts to get really complicated as we start to look at the role of accountants and small businesses and consumers in other countries. And then we also have systems around just the idea of moving money and moving value back and forth between people, and understanding what is legal and what works for one country but doesn't work for another. So the way we get to attack these giant problems is something that we call design for delight. It's basically our version of human-centered design. It has three simple components to it. One, around building deep customer empathy. We do that by researching, by observing, creating emotional analogs. I'll tell you a good emotional analog story in a little while. Then we go broad to go narrow, zoom out and zoom in. We use synthesis, ideation, and filtering to both clarify what our biggest opportunities are and then experiment with those really quickly. And speaking of experimenting, we prototype and experiment with customers to quickly test our assumptions. And then we make our decision based on what we learn, whether we're going to persevere or pivot. So, relatively simple. The other thing we have is something called customer-driven innovation. I've talked about this. This is the business of design, where we recognize unsolved customer problems. We recognize that we and our partners can solve those problems well, and we can do so in a way that's hard to copy. And that, as we say, is what success looks like. This is bad design. Sorry about that. I didn't put this slide together, but this is sort of how these things all work together, where we use the process of design to uncover the needs of our customers, to look for things that we can solve well, to look for ways that we can do so in a way that's hard to copy, and then we define what we call our ideal state. What are the customer benefits that we can deliver for our customer? And we have three, like I mentioned already: more time, more money, complete confidence. Whether you are a small business, whether you're a consumer, whether you're a self-employed person that's sort of somewhere in the middle and you don't know whether you're a small business or a consumer. And then we have a great partnership strategy where we use banks and accountants and education and the government and other partners to help us to deliver benefits to our customers. And then we scale that benefit as we deliver it, first by thinking about who's the one person, the N of one, if you will, that we solve that problem for really well. We make sure that we're doing so in a way, like I said, that's meaningful to them, that maybe they talk to others about. Wow, you should really get into this. So, you know, our first sort of proof of scale is word of mouth. And then we use things like, you know, marketing tactics and all that to open our funnel. And then we come up with ways to rapidly figure out how to monetize on top of that. But what I wanted to do is I want to tell you some cool stories about how this design stuff is changing the world. And the first thing I want to talk about is empathy. I don't know how many of you guys have ever seen this. This is called an empathy suit. So this woman is literally learning what it feels like to be 90 years old and walk down the steps. So she's got weights on her ankles, and she's got restraints in her knees, and she's got goggles that make her feel a little more blind, and she's got stuff on her wrists and her hands. That all of this is like sort of like giving her, oh my God, this is what it feels like to go down steps as a 90-year-old person. And designers love this kind of exploration because it helps us to understand what's the real problem we're solving here. What's the combination of events that sort of, you know, what's the confluence there that's like, wow, this is where the real problem lies. And there's different examples of this. We got this woman that's learning what it's like to lift something off a heavy shelf with the same kind of constraints maybe. I don't know what the helmet's for, that's kind of funny. We got the woman here that's learning what it's like to climb in and out of an SUV while you're pregnant. I think the woman with the gloves on is feeling the sensation of what it's like to have some sort of a tingling sensation in your hands when you start to get some sort of an onset of arthritis or something like that. A really great example of how that empathy turns into design that matters is in IDEO did this exploration where they went and they looked at CAT scans, and they looked at, that's not a great experience for anybody that's been through a CAT scan, but if you think about a 5-year-old that's going into a room and it's like, here's what I need you to do. I need you to lie on this table. I need you to be super still. I need you to be super quiet. And then I'm going to put you in this tube, and you're going to have to sit in there super quiet and super still. And no, nothing's going to happen to you. But there's going to be a lot of crazy noises in there. And basically through iteration, through spending time watching kids kick and scream their way into and out of this tunnel, IDEO figured out that there was a way to change the narrative around getting a scan and make kids feel a little bit more like, okay, this is cool. This is going to be cool. And that initial moment of walking into the room and being like, this is not scary at all. So what's really, really interesting I wanted to share with you guys is that while empathy helps us to uncover problems, empathy itself actually helps solve problems. And so there's actually a proven study, there's actually several studies in a row that came to this conclusion, that doctors that are trained in empathy, their patients have better outcomes. And it comes through in a couple of different ways, and some of these ways are kind of obvious, right? A doctor who understands their patients and who knows what they're going through and has felt those feelings is a better communicator, understands what they need to hear, understands what actions they're going to need to take. But some of this is also like two people that gave the same recommendations on the same treatment. The person that had the empathy training, like the common cold was reduced by a day. Like I would pay for that, right? And we're talking about severity reduced. We're talking about chemical measurements where, I don't know what these are, IL-8 neutrophils, but these are legit measurements of whether or not how sick you are and how severe that sickness is. And these were impacted by the doctor's ability to connect with the patient. It's like talking to your plants, right? Like there's something kind of weird about that, but at the same time, this has been proven in a clinical study. Same thing with diabetes, where doctors that treated patients with diabetes that had this empathy training reduced acute metabolic complications. Again, this is about like changing the chemistry in your patients because you treat them, because like you understand them. And obviously, like I mentioned, this idea with even something with cancer, reducing depression, that's meaningful for a cancer patient. Improved quality of life is meaningful for a cancer patient. And the desire for more information and to take a more participative role in your own treatment, that's meaningful for cancer patients. So the fact that doctors can use empathy to connect with their customers drives meaningful change in those patients' lives. The second story I want to talk about is the idea of how we go broad to go narrow and using synthesis, ideation, and filtering to clarify our biggest opportunities. And for that, I'd like to talk about a really, really cool project that started here in Dallas by a chef I'll talk about in a second. But here's a crazy statistic for you, which is in Dallas County, a kid that goes to jail, a juvenile that goes to jail, there's a 50% chance that that kid's going to go back to jail. That's a big, terrible number. And if you go back the second time, the odds are crazy high, like 80%, 90%, that you're going to be in and out of jail for the rest of your life, which is not only a bad outcome for that person, but that's a bad outcome for Dallas. That's a lot of money that we spend dealing with these kids coming in and out of the system. So this is Chad Hauser. You guys are in Dallas. You guys probably, some of you have probably heard of this guy. So Chad was a 5-star chef at a restaurant downtown called Parigi. He had a successful business. He was making plenty of money. Chad was doing everything right. He volunteered to go make ice cream with some of these juvenile offenders at the Dallas Farmers Market. And he sat down with these kids and he taught them how to make ice cream. And because Chad's a good chef and because Chad doesn't take no for an answer, these kids won the competition. And the kids said, "Oh my God, this is awesome. This is what I want to do with my life. I finally know what that is." And Chad kind of looked at them and thought to himself, "I agree. I want to do that too." So he went home and this idea haunted him. He wanted to help, but it's a big, hard problem. It's got lots of stuff and it's hard to fix. These kids don't just need jobs, which is kind of the thing in the middle here, but they need a place to sleep at night, right? Like, you're not going to be successful at a job if you can't eat, or if you're not safe at home, or if you don't have a home, and if you don't have people that look at you and go, "Shouldn't you be at work?" So like, they needed all of this stuff. And while Chad looked at this and thought to himself, "Oh my God, this is an enormous problem. I can't solve this problem." What he figured out was, you know what? I'm going to start small. I'm just going to start with jobs. And then he took the idea of, okay, all right, so let's teach these kids how to cook. What could we do? Well, he had some assumptions. And the assumptions that he had were that we can teach these kids to cook, and not just cook, but we can teach these kids to cook world-class food because he's Chad Hauser and he's a 5-star chef and he doesn't do anything halfway. But he also had this other leap of faith, which was that people would be willing to pay for food that was prepared by criminals, right? And then he had another one that was that we can give these kids everything else they need to be successful. And then he had another one, which is that we can use this restaurant as a forum for social good. And so he had to narrow again. And he narrowed to, we can teach these kids to cook world-class food. And so what did he do? He created a pop-up restaurant concept. He didn't have to build the whole restaurant to figure this out. He didn't have to staff the entire thing. He didn't have to worry about the bottom line. He didn't have to worry about anything except proving one thing. I can get people to come eat the best meal of their lives prepared by these kids that are just out of jail. And he did it. And he sold these events out over and over again, and critics came to him and they said, "This is good." And he's like, "Dude, I'm Chad Hauser." You know, "Yeah, this is good. I told you these guys could do this." So these kids learned how to cook food, serve food, clean up the dishes, wash the dishes in the back. They learned every aspect of working in a restaurant. And all they did was these pop-up restaurants for a year. And they built the credibility that they needed, and they tightened up what these kids needed so that by the time they got to their full-scale restaurant, with a full-time permanent location and everything these interns needed to succeed, he knew what that was going to be. He knew how that was going to work, and he knew, most importantly, that people would show up to pay food for to pay for food that was prepared by criminals. He knew that he could provide these kids with everything else they were going to need. So he experimented his way into this thing. He could have opened a restaurant and just tried to solve that whole thing all at one time. He picked the biggest thing and then, or the most important thing. He tested that. He worked his way from there. And if you ask him now, he will tell you, if I had tried to just make a restaurant and get it to work, that first year would have failed miserably. It was so important to prove, what did these kids need? And proving what these kids needed was the most important thing to help get this thing off the ground. Now, the cool thing about this concept, Cafe Momentum, by the way, go to Cafe Momentum. Be blown away. And, you know, as you'll see in a second, like, these guys are doing great stuff in this town. Once they checked off the box that they could give these kids jobs, then they went back and they worked their way through all these other things, this bigger system that needed to be true for these kids to really succeed. And you don't need to be able to read every word on this thing to know that between a 12-month paid internship program, a 13-week orientation where they spent time with a caseworker getting to know who these kids were, what their situation was, what were they going to need to be successful out of the gate, that these kids walked away with an 11% likelihood of going back into jail the second time. So, meaningful difference. Looked at as numbers, we're talking about $8 million that we've saved the city of Dallas in 3 years, and $130 million in lifetime deferred savings for kids that would have been in and out of the system. And that's money that you can put back into things like other Cafe Momentums. All right, so the third concept I want to talk about around prototyping and experimenting with customers is there's a really, really cool business concept here in Dallas called Better Block. And what they've done is they've gone out and they've looked at these big, complicated problems around how to attack urban renewal. And what they did was they broke it down to one block at a time. And what could we do next weekend to prove to people that this blighted corner could be spectacularly different if we just changed a couple simple rules? And the problem they had was that the rules are these ordinances, like these city ordinances that have been around for a long time with the hope and help of like keeping people from committing crime or keeping people or opening up traffic this direction or whatever it is. But over time they've become this knot that makes it almost impossible for you to move and make things happen inside a city. So what they did was, not only did they sort of prove out this concept of let's prototype a street corner, which I'll show you in a second, but they also created plans that any city activist could use to get a permit for a street corner and then create a space that people would start to be able to understand what it's like if this was walkable, or if you could ride your bike here, or if you could sit outside and have lunch here, or if there was actually a functioning restaurant in this empty space. And these prototypes were not hard to do. Like, this is the stuff they put in front of gutters so that the trash doesn't go in the gutter after a big flood. But this is also a walkway and a little median. And some potted plants. They didn't even take the pots off, right? Here's a patio. Like, these are not hard. You just needed to try it. Just needed to try it. And getting the ordinance flipped for this, to actually put a patio there, would take months and years, and there's no data. Well, now we've got data. We've got behavioral data. Hey, we did this stuff for a weekend, and look at the difference in traffic patterns. This is literally somebody with a can of green paint and a roller They put in a bike path. You can see that it's a tree-lined street now. There's they converted one lane of traffic into parking spots. It slowed down the traffic, which was actually really important to convey the idea of walkability and to make it feel inviting for people riding a bike. So all of this stuff together, one weekend, like 4 different prototypes of a bike path and some parking and some patios and some walkways. And then in each one of those places, putting up a little flyer that says, oh, by the way, this is breaking ordinance number such and such. They've done 8 projects in 7 cities, and 100% of these experiments have resulted in an increase in business revenue, 80% increase in retail sales of existing places. 71% of these experiments resulted in some kind of an ordinance change, and 63% of these experiments became permanent things that actually happened on those city blocks. All for a bucket of paint, a couple flower pots, those things that you put in front of the gutter. So really, really cool examples of prove it first before you go build it, before you have to go have the fight. Having the video of people behaving in the space, having the traffic count, having the data to be able to go back and make the case that not only do people want these things, not only do people say they want these things, but we're looking at their actual behavior. We're looking at the fact that we actually saw revenue go up. We actually saw traffic counts go up. Those are the things that you can use to make a compelling case for somebody to overturn an ordinance that's been sitting around for 70 years. So, 3 things. 1, use empathy to uncover real problems. These are the true needs of your customers, not whether or not they're using your product, but whether or not they've got a problem that's worth solving. Understand that bigger system and start with the riskiest assumption, but don't forget about the bigger problem, but start small. But don't forget, but start small. And aim beyond what's possible. Don't let things like ordinances get in the way of a quick prototype and a little bit of data, a little bit of behavior that can actually make a case for you to make big change. And the world will thank you.
So we have left a little longer time on the back end of this event for the open Q&A portion. And what I would like to encourage is, this room is extremely diverse. We have, definitely leaders of product development. We have CIOs in the room, CEOs in the room. And one of the things that I will tell you is that James is phenomenal at really breaking down the barriers between design, or the thoughts around design thinking, and breaking down the barrier between that and business strategy. So as you're sitting here, if you have any questions at all, I would like to just open it up. And this is one that I definitely trust to be able to give you some wise advice. So at this time, feel free to just raise your hand and I will come directly to you. And if you don't mind, just introduce yourself before the question.
I'm Niraj, I work for Verizon. At Intuit, how do you collect customer feedback? Because in this case, I think it's a completely online company, right? So you don't really interact with physically with customers. So how would you understand what customers are thinking, and how can you be empathetic towards the customer when you don't know what customers are looking for?
That's a great question. So one of the most important things we do is we spend time observing customers. Everybody in my company here has gone to see at least 2 self-employed people at their house or on the job or whatever it is. I've been to see another 50 accountants in their offices and watch them work and watch them interact with their customers and watch them interact with their staff. So while our products aren't necessarily a one-to-one relationship moment with our customers, our designers, our product managers, our engineers, our marketing folks, everybody at Intuit is expected to spend time following them to their homes, to their offices, along on their jobs, and understand what's the behavior that they're doing. It's fascinating how many, like we've built quite a bit of accounting software. It's very feature rich, right? Like it's, especially the stuff that my team's working on is like tremendously powerful accounting software. It's got, I don't know if you numbered it, like 1,000 features. You go to these offices and you watch these guys do stuff, and what you realize is that so much of their work is not happening in the screen. It's not happening in the program. It's what my buddy back in the office calls the meat space. It's all of this sort of like ritual behavior that's going on where they're pulling things out and piling them here, and then they're spreading them out over here, and then they're moving them through this thing, and they're putting a sticky note on things and moving it around. I mean, the processes that people have to basically compensate for the things that they don't even know that they need help with. And then as you ask them about that, and you ask them about things like, how does your security work? Or how do you think about like keeping data safe? And they're like, oh. And then you look at their desk and they've got sticky notes of all their passwords hanging off the bottom of their screens, and a box of paper under their desk that's got like tax returns in it that need to be shredded but are sort of like sitting in the need to be shredded box, because if they're kind of like me, they've got the shredder that if you run 4 million pieces of paper through it, it dies and you have to buy another shredder. So they've sort of like started to slow down the process of shredding. So the behavior that we see in the office is so much different than the behavior that we see in the analytics that come through the program. And that is how we get the full understanding, not only of what their workflow entails, but what are the problems that are left unsolved. Is that a pretty good answer? All right.
I'm Sarah Vassar, I'm from Capital One, and my question is about influence. I love your examples, especially from the Dallas area, because they're really different, and outside the box of what's typically in our corporate environment. When you're teaching teams, I don't know how much you have to do this at Intuit, but in your previous life maybe, like how do you get folks to not think, well, that's not us, like we're different. How do we do it? Because we don't have the need to put plants on a street, right? We're more internal, or we're regulated, or we're, how do you help get outside of that mindset?
Well, let me tell you a funny story. I shared this story with the guys in Austin too. We had this. There's a couple different pieces to that question, or to the question, Sarah. And one of them is, how do you manufacture empathy for people in an environment where, or how do you quickly get them to believe that this is valuable? And I think that everybody here is familiar with sitting in a boardroom with a lot of other very smart people, and typically the person who's the smartest and has the highest title sort of makes a decision with lots of great input and then says, this is the way we're doing it. And what has been really, really helpful is using customer data, a quick experiment, some video, something like that, to help people understand that they don't necessarily know as much as they think they know in terms of that. I've never seen a piece of customer video that somebody wasn't willing to go, okay, let me see that. Let me see more of that. And then would it give them pause to think about, all right, maybe we're really not solving this problem well. But the other thing we do is we're trying to get individual people in the company into a mindset of what it's like to struggle. And that's the part that's tricky, right? Like, it's one thing to go watch an accountant work. But you walk away from that experience going, well, I'm not an accountant, and I don't know what that feels like. And so you instead have to sort of go, what does it feel like, accountant? And they say, well, it's like anything that you do for the first time. It's just kind of hard to get started. And then we go off and we go, oh, good. There we go. It's hard to get started. It's hard to get started. Let's go give ourselves some examples of it's hard to get started. And so that's like this idea of an emotional analog. And so we were doing this whole first use exploration, and we all sat down and we were like, all right, we want to get sensational experiences that help us understand what it feels like to get started. And so a team went to iFly to do skydiving for the first time. And their first use experience at skydiving is incredible, because you sit in a little room and they show you a slideshow, and then they say, there are 5 hand signals that you need to know. This is like, put your hands up. This is like, make your legs straight, right? So they're teaching you these like sign language. And everybody's like, got it, got it, got it. And then they put you in the wind tunnel, and they turn on the fan, and 1,000 miles an hour of wind goes straight up. And you can't see anything, and you can't hear anything. And then you understand why the hand signals would be helpful. And so the funny thing was that, doing skydiving is not cheap. So like most of us are watching, and this one guy is in there doing it. And he's flailing around like a freak, and they're trying to do the hand signals in front of him, and he's just like paddling like a dog the whole time and doing nothing right. And there's 2 guys in there. There's one that's doing the hand signals, and there's another one that's basically holding him, like holding him at his waist. And at some point he realizes that he's got it. And he comes out and he's like, I did it. And we're like, you did not do it. And he's like, yeah, I totally, like, I figured and there were like 3 things that came up. 1, did you ever see the guy with the hand signals? No, I couldn't see anything. But I figured it out eventually. We're like, okay, did you know about the guy that was holding you by the waist the entire time? No, he let go. No, he didn't. He held you the whole time. But the cool thing was you didn't know he was holding you. So you really started to believe that you were doing it yourself. You really got that confidence that you're going to be okay, and you calmed down, And for 30 seconds, you just didn't flail. He held you. You just stopped flailing, and you were almost sort of doing it right. But if he'd dropped you, you probably would have killed yourself. And so we walked away from that experience. It's like, yeah, this is tax season, man. Tax season is the wind tunnel. And we you go back and you start thinking about the onboarding experience, or some sort of like helpful tooltip or something that's going to show up in an accountant's software on April 12th. Bing, need help? You got like 3 phones. I'm in an office. I told you I go to this guy's office. I'm in an accountant's office. He's got a phone here and a phone here. He's got a clock here and a clock here. He's got 1, 2, 3 calculators. This is one guy in one office. And you can see from his tools what's important to him, right? And you think about that guy doing 2 calculators like the keyboard player from the band Yes, and both phones are ringing, and his cell phone is ringing. And you think about the tooltips and like how he's like, this is not what I need right now, right? But that idea of the best help is you don't even know it's there. You don't even think about it. Like you're not aware that you're being helped. That was sort of our big takeaway as far as that idea of putting together an emotional analog that helped frame how we could be most helpful was by almost not even knowing we were there. I think you have to find your wind tunnel, Sarah. I think you have to just figure out what is that thing that's going to connect with the people that are making the product and the people that are paying for it, that really helps them all to sort of say, okay, this is a problem worth solving, and this is how we're going to think about it. That was an incredibly long answer. Sorry, I had like 6 examples in it and all kinds of stuff.
Hi, I'm Sherry James. I work for oil and gas refining company. And so my question is around fear. So we're introducing XD concepts on onboarding our next generation of leaders.
Cool.
But there's a fear of that with our guys that work in the refineries. They've been there forever. You know, those are the guys that are twisting tools and pipes. They actually don't necessarily want change. There's a comfort in being the only guy who knows how to do that one thing. So how would you give some, some guidance on how do we approach that particular persona?
Man, I mean, there are so many like locked-in industries where people have been doing the same thing forever, and I don't have a great answer for how you change their mindset. I think that some people will be dug in. I think that there's a great chance for leaders to get empathy for their own teams by spending time listening to them, digging into, well, why is that scary? Well, how could that be better? And being both a more empathetic leader in terms of listening to those fears and thinking about how do we use that to tell that story, right? Like so much of influence and so much of organizational change really comes down to, we heard you, we spent time watching the things you do. We want to introduce the concept of design to you guys, not as something that's going to come and take away your job, but it's going to help maybe make your job more valuable to the organization. And perhaps even make the work you do more visible to others. I mean, that's one of the great superpowers of design, is that you can make things that are very invisible very visible. You know, like the idea of the customer journey or a process workflow map or something. When a designer comes in and shows you that they understand what you're doing and how it works, and they're like this, right? And they show you and you're like, yeah, it's exact. Well, there's like this one little thing. Designers actually have an amazing opportunity, good designers have an amazing ability to sort of facilitate that kind of a conversation and get people that wouldn't talk to talk and look at how they, oh, we all deliver this thing together. We have a designer on my team right now who's doing what's called blueprinting, where we sort of put a journey together on the wall and then we unpack what is every function and what's everybody's role, and then what are the services, and what are the legal watch outs, all that stuff. Who are all the people that are involved? But an exercise like that is so powerful in helping to bring people that are like a little reluctant along on that journey.
My name is Masood. I'm from Dell EMC. So, James, one question I have is, how does Intuit as an org establish a culture of design thinking in a company? Because design thinking is just not for designers. Every role, every team member has to have that mindset for the success of the product and to have that customer experience. So is there anything that Intuit does differently? Because I know that they are very mature in this area. I would like to seek some advice in evangelizing design thinking across the org.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So there's sort of like three examples that I can give here. One at the very sort of business framework objective level. We have, we have our mission and our vision and our what we call our true north and our strategy and our priorities that roll up to that. It's called our alignment triangle. And our true north is who we serve and in what order. And this is kind of crazy. I think I've shared this with some of you guys before, but our customers come first. I'm sorry, our employees come first. And after employees come customers. And after customers come partners. And after partners come stakeholders, or stockholders. Stockholders. They're all stakeholders. Stockholders. And so we make decisions by putting the customer before the business. We have to. We make decisions that impact our employees ahead of our customers. That's that is setting an expectation culturally at the organizational level that makes other things like design thinking a little bit easier to sort of take hold. I don't think everybody in this room is going to be able to go back and change the true north of their company tomorrow, but I will say that that is a gift that Intuit has in terms of being able to put their customers before their business outcomes. Now, it's not to say that we don't struggle, but we have principles that help us to sort of make those decisions when we're in those tiebreaker moments about how do we do this. And sometimes we will make a decision that's better for our customer than it is for the business. It's the right thing to do, and at the end of the day, we feel like it pays us back in the long run. The second thing is that design, the expectation of design thinking is driven by leaders. In our case, again, super helpful that our CEO and our chairman of the board who founded the company 30 years ago have literally flown site to site around the world and given the presentation and set the expectation. I need everybody in this office. I need everybody in this company. I need all 8,000 employees, whether you're in HR or in finance or marketing or sales or product. I need you guys to go out and I need you to meet 2 self-employed people. And then walking them, all of those employees, through CDI and D for D and how to do it and how to write a great problem statement and how to craft an ideal state and how to identify what your customer benefit metrics are and what your actual metrics that are the proxies for those customer benefit metrics are. So you do need leadership to reinforce, because one of the critical things about this kind of stuff is, and I call this design maturity, right? Like organizations achieve design maturity with tons of work and lots of reinforcement at every level. And as people move in with new ideas and move out, that we're the keepers of how all this stuff gets done, you dilute the belief in whether or not design thinking or design is the way forward. So that's a watch out. But like I said, having the expectation driven by leaders, and it shows up in the questions they ask. Have you observed this problem? This problem that you're solving, have you watched an actual customer struggle with that actual problem? That's a simple way that a leader can reinforce the expectation of spend time with customers. Have you narrowed on what the most important thing to prove here is? And what's your experiment and how fast can you run it? And if it's going to take you 3 weeks, you need a lighter experiment. Like, how do you encourage them to do it fast? How do you encourage them to, give them the time and the space to do the work? And then the last thing that Intuit does that I think is awesome is they have a whole community of people. They aren't necessarily designers, although there are some in there that are, but they're called innovation catalysts. These guys are facilitators of the process. They understand how to do it. They understand what makes a good experiment. They understand how to do an empathy analog like the one I talked about let's go learn how to skydive and feel what that feels like. But these facilitators are critical in just helping a team that may be heads down and like, we got to make this thing. It's got to be done in a week. And I think that everybody in this room will say, hey, making the wrong thing real fast is a waste of time, right? Or spending a year operating under an assumption that you could have proven in week 1 and been like, oh my God, let's not do that. It's so important that that organizations understand the value of that lightweight test, like the pop-up restaurant concept. Like, prove that before you move on. Prove that you can get that love before you move on. So I hope those are good examples. I mean, Intuit is not perfect by any stretch, but like I said, the fact that they've declared in their strategy the role that where customers and the business lie in order, the fact that they have set the expectation with leaders first and then with employees second, that everybody's going to do it like this. And the fact that then they've got this community. I'm the head of the community for the Plano office, or the sponsor, I should say. We actually have great people that sort of lead that team internally. But those three things, I think, are great ways that Intuit makes it happen.
We have time for one more question, but by all means, James is willing to stay after just a little bit longer if anyone would like to ask any follow-up questions after the event.
James, thank you. I'm Barry from Zask, and my question kind of builds on many of the things that you mentioned in the questions that other people had, and I'd like your thoughts on the following. How much empathy is enough? So as you go through the process, you talk about this and the concept of something being lightweight. So how many accountants do you talk to before you make a product decision? How many street corners do you go on? How many pop-up restaurants, do you need to do before you make that decision? I think there's probably different in different industries, but I'd like your thoughts on when you've flipped the switch from, well, that's just one person. Why are we going to make a product decision based on one person's input?
Yeah.
Versus having sufficient data to say this is real, this is a real problem that we need to solve in our product. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So we had a design consultant come out and talk to us about this, and a lot of this comes down to qualitative data versus quantitative data, right? And how do you sort of how do you reconcile those together? If you spend time with 3 customers, maybe it's 5, and you feel like you see a pattern that's super clear, that's probably directionally helpful. It's probably not enough data to make a decision for an organization, but it's directionally super helpful. One of the things you might do is you might look at that in terms of let's make sure that we get our recruiting right. Like, let's not, if you get in the room and the first person you talk to is like, yeah, I actually don't do that job. Well, okay, put them aside and don't ask them a bunch of questions and then they say, well, I think I would probably do. That's not helpful. I mean, so much of the observational stuff is really about like, the behavior is more important than what they say they would do all day long. And it's a data point. It's not the only one. It's the one that, quite honestly, in many cases, it's the one where you go, oh my God, I learned something that I was never going to learn. So it's not a great way to validate things that you already think you know. It's not a great way to like test your assumptions with empathy. Empathy is a place where I would go looking for ideas. I would go looking for, what's a problem that's not yet solved? Or, we're in this space. I want to watch how you do this thing now. That kind of thing. So a lot of our observational work is about spending time with 3, 4, 5 different people and looking at what are the tools they use, what are the processes they use today. Just show us how you do. Why do you do that? And why is that important? That kind of stuff. I think that once you get to a more of a validation stage, again, there's like, if you show it to 3 people and 3 out of 3 people don't understand it, you can test it with more people if you want, but I would start to think that it's broken. If you test it with 3 out of 3 people and it's broken, and you think to yourself, I just think I didn't talk to the right 3 people, that's fair. Go talk to 3 more people. And if those 3 people you feel like are better recruited and it still doesn't work, I would take that as a sign, right? Like, again, like, you don't need 100 people to prove that an experience is broken. Once you start to get into the details where it's like, oh, we're kind of looking at, there were places where scale matters, and where and especially as you start thinking about things like, Well, the behavior is going to be different in Detroit than it is in Dallas, than it is in Boston, than it is in India. Like don't underestimate the value of how geography or stuff like that can impact your results too. And then the last thing that's really kind of interesting is we've been conducting this research with we have a researcher on staff right now, and he's been showing us how to do our follow me to the office things in this sort of like, you get the right information, but you do the same things every time. And because you do the same things every time, you actually get a long-term quantitative opportunity where you can start to tag the same thing showed up in 10 conversations, or the same behaviors showed up in 5 different geographies, and that kind of a thing. So taking advantage of just repeatable processes, recording the crap out of everything you do so that you've got video and audio and all that kind of stuff, so that you can take that observational work and scale it. Because that's the other big issue is like, a guy went off and did this with 3 customers and came back and said this is the right thing to do. Well, we weren't there and we didn't see it, and now you're saying trust me. And that's why I think it's so important for the whole team to see the problem. So when leaders are asking the question, it's not have you seen it, it's has the whole team seen the problem? Has the whole team gone and observed this problem happen in the wild? Because as engineers sit down to solve a problem or to build an experience or to set up a service, if they're really clear on what the best possible outcome is based on the problem they've observed, they can be creative too, right? Like they can be part of the, ooh, you know what? Actually, we could do it like this, and they can have ideas too. So you don't want to just put all of the burden of collecting empathy and collecting that data on your product manager or your designer or both. Bring your engineers into that kitchen too, because you'd be, probably you wouldn't be. You'd be pleasantly surprised, I hope, with the fact that most engineers get tons out of that. And in fact, when we hire interns from a place like UTD, one of the biggest things that they come back with as a takeaway from working with us is that they actually got to meet the customers that they're building for, and that was like super energizing and interesting to them. But I agree that there's also a point where you have to sort of say it's time to make something. Like the time for empathy is over, and now we have to move on and go do that. But I do think you need to keep your customers close, but be clear on, are we learning? Are we validating? Are we coming up with new ideas, or are we trying to narrow and sort of plant a flag in the thing that we've done? And if you've done that work in the right order, and you've recruited with the right people, and the right people have gone along on those missions to get that empathy at the right points in time, those are the things that I think help to keep that process clean. And then the teams know we should move, or we know we're not ready.